So yeah, welcome to our workshop today. That we're going to be talking about accessible language. This is a thing that it kind of will seem, how to put it, it will seem like one of those things where it's like, okay, I think I get how to use language. I'm an adult, I've grown up, I've been working on this for however long I've been alive. But there are some things that happen to us as we go throughout our lives where we kind of learn some bad habits. And what I'm going to do today is just kind of talk about those. And can you still see? Yes, now that I've done full screen. Great. Just talk about those, talk about what are the barriers for accessibility with language specifically, and go through some like nice solves for some of the problems you might have, because this is really important if you're writing content for anybody, especially if that content is going to be put in a public sphere like on the web. So a little introduction to who I am. I actually started out as a musician. For those of you who don't know me, I was a recording artist and traveled around the UK and abroad giving gigs. Played the piano, have done since I was 4, and basically my career didn't take off to the level that I thought it would. But actually it also kind of, as I learned more about music, I got really interested in the science behind it, and I actually went to do a degree in audio engineering. And I was really interested in like manipulating sounds and recording sounds, and really obsessed with working with tape and hardware. And yeah, it was a lot of fun. Not long after that, I actually traversed into being a computer scientist. So I'm finishing my thesis now. Hopefully we'll have a submission in the next month or two, on digital musical instruments and accessibility. And so it's kind of crossing over from my audio engineering background and into accessibility in the world of computers and how we can make digital instruments more accessible. And that's a PhD that I'm doing with the Mixed Reality Lab in Nottingham. And when I was working on that, I kind of found myself as having a voice as an advocate for different things. So I worked on a lot of events about inclusion in technology, and I've then since become like a speaker on accessibility, and I've done lots of training to become a certified web accessibility specialist and a few other things. And so now that's my full-time job. I'm an accessibility consultant, and that's what I do for various people, but mainly within the music industry. We have a slight delay. Come on, A. So in this workshop, what we're going to be learning about today is about accessible language. So why is language an accessibility barrier? That's something I'm going to cover. The positive impacts for using accessible language, how to get started using accessible language, so how you can actually start today to remedy some of the things we might do. And then using accessibility language across different types of content, because we know wherever we might be posting or writing, it can change what we're, the style of how we're writing. So how do we mitigate that? And we're going to actually do some exercises to try it out for itself. So don't panic, you're not going to be tested on any of this. It's just a little fun exercise to try out how we would go about doing these things for our work, and how to consider accessible language in terms of transforming language that's inaccessible to accessible. And then at the end, I'm going to give you a link to some resources so that you can take away and use them in your own work. So that will be something that you can go away and use, hopefully going forward, but you can always contact me. My Twitter handle is in the bottom of every slide, and my email I'll put back at the end. And it's also on all of the resources I'm sending out to you today. So let's look at why do we write. So let's have a think about the reasons why we communicate using written text. You might have seen these terms before, because these are the very academic terms for writing. So expository writing, persuasive writing, and descriptive writing. What we're talking about here is helping people, persuading people, and informing people. So the real thing is how to write for people in different contexts of what we want to achieve. But we should never really forget that our audience is people. So when we use complex language, that isn't inclusive to all people. And that's the thing that we're going to think about today. So let's have a look. Complex language is more difficult for people, not just for people with disabilities. This isn't just an accessibility requirement, but there are lots of reasons why complex language can be more difficult. So if you have poor working memory or are easily distracted, those things can mean that you don't read in the same way. And when you don't read in the same way as as anybody else, it can struggle with complex language. It can hold you up in a sentence. It can be something that is more distracting than useful in what you're doing. You can also find that it's difficult for people who are slower at reading or processing that information. And people who have difficulty identifying the main points from a long passage of text, you'll find that the more complex the language you use, the more you create this difficulty. Anybody that has a very literal understanding of language, and this works in different neurological conditions. So the autistic community, you might find that if you're describing something but not using a very literal description, it will catch people out and they'll struggle to understand the instruction that you're giving them. If you're reading in a rush, which many of us are, or many of us are reading on a phone or a tablet or a device that's just not suited for and set up for like proper reading or reading in depth. And if you speak more than one language, actually, that's a common thing for just language processing. So we end up like having to reread things quite a lot if we speak more than one language. So why on earth do we use complex language when we write then? Like, why are we doing this to people? It's what we were taught to do in school, I guess. You were told to find a word, you were told to expand your vocabulary, or at least I was in the British school system. And, getting to a certain grade level, you're expected to use more complex words. And so you're trained all the way through to academia. And I'm actually having to undo a lot of that right now in writing my thesis, because my thesis is about accessibility, and I'll be damned if it's written inaccessibly. So it's one of those things that you train and you think of that's something that I need to do, because we want to sound intelligent some of the time. That is a motivation for why we use complex language. We'll choose a longer word or a more impressive word, or me and Kevin often all have a conversation and one of us will go, oh, that's a good word, because it's just when you do that, you're like, oh yeah, that's a really interesting word. And it's one of those things that we adopt it because, I don't know, we want to sound more intelligent, but it's actually I think it's a really difficult task to explain something that has complexity in a very accessible way. I think that is, to me, it is a sign of higher intelligence more than anything. When we're talking to a technical audience, we feel like we have to use technical words. We feel like we'll be pulled up if we don't use the correct terminology, or we like dumb down. I hate phrases like that, but if we seem to simplify things or oversimplify things, we'll be concerned that the audience won't receive it very well. And when we're using industry-specific words or things that we term jargon in English, those things we think we need to use, and so we will use them, and they might add complexity to our sentences, and that will be something that just something that we feel like we have to do. There's some really interesting research actually about this, that even if you go to an academic reading level, and there's still a preference towards plain language. So even if you're talking to industry experts, often they prefer to read something in plain language than the technical speak that they're used to. And that's just because it is easier. And it's just something that is kind of a misconception, that just because you have this technical specialist or specialist in a subject, they'll want to read it in, academic speak. And often, who wants to read a paper in academic speak? I mean, I don't think I've met anybody that really enjoys that process, because there is a lot of rereading, making sure you're grasping what's been put into the essence of the paper. And it takes time, even for somebody who's an expert in the field. We're also told not to use certain words. So if we're avoiding certain words, we might choose a more complex word to put in its place, and that could be a problem in itself. Or we could be following a content style writing guide, which you might have if you're working in a business environment. You are working on the content side, and there might be certain words that are like keywords or SEO words, that's search engine optimization words, that you're trying to fit into the content that you're writing. And that could be a reason that you introduce complexity. And generally, this is genuinely why we do it most of the time, is that we're writing without really thinking about our audience. And that's not a negative, and that's not an accusation. It's just a lot of the time we write and we review it based on our own biases. So we're not really thinking about the person who's going to be reading it at the other end. And that can be a problem, because we read it and we think, oh yeah, I'm happy with my tone of voice, I'm happy with the way that sounds. Then you review it with people who are potentially within the same industry as you. You review it with people who are at the same academic level as you. You review it across an audience that is kind of, I'm forgetting words. Let's use a non-complex, like people who are the same. So there isn't a diversity in the audience that you're actually reviewing it with. And then that, if you're writing for the general public, especially, that is something that we forget to think about. So yeah, all of these actually cause quite a lot of barriers to language and to products as well. The issue that we have across the world is that 1 in 5 of your potential audience could be excluded by complex writing, because this is reported statistics, but 1 in 5 people have a form of disability. And as it stands at the moment, that figure's reported statistics as well. I really hate pulling it out or tripping it, because actually I think the number is a lot more. Because there's a lot of stigma around disability and reporting, and there's a lot of reasons why somebody, like for example, myself, I'm neurodivergent, but I've never reported that in my entire life, because I've never really known that I was neurodivergent until much later on in my life. And having attention deficit means that reading is one of those things for me as well. Like, I prefer accessible language, but I didn't really understand that was a thing for me until recently. And I think many people exist like that. Many people have perhaps had something that they've worked through school. People with dyslexia don't necessarily write it down everywhere that they go and report it to statistics, but it is something that is very affected by the language that we use every day in our writing styles. So accessible language, we put the reader's needs first. We allow readers to understand a message the first time that they read it. This is really key, because it means you can increase your reading times. It appeals to a wider audience. Internationalization is another big factor of accessible language. If we're using plain language and accessible language, that generally gets translated easier. It creates less confusion for the reader. It proves the international readability, as I just mentioned there, because it's more easily translated, but it is also, in English especially, you're using this form of English that is easier to translate mentally as well as translate for anybody doing a service. You're decreasing the reading times over what you're putting online, and that's really important actually, because the reading time for websites is really, really small. And so like complexity of sentences and everything like that adds to reading time. And honestly, your people just don't stay on websites long enough for that at the moment, according to research. And increases in customer engagement as well, and it benefits all type of people. I'm not about to tell you that accessibility is for everyone, because that's a very dangerous route to go down in terms of an ableist view, because we erase the people that accessibility is for. But what you can find is that when you focus on providing accessible language for, especially for the people that really need that language to be clear, you'll find, as I said, the preference, even in the highest academic community, can be that plain language is the preference. And so there is a fringe benefit, but it's not what you should be focusing your work on. You should be focusing on the needs of the people that require it. Okay, so if you need to sell this internally at your company, I just have some quick statistics for you about accessibility. So companies that prioritize digital inclusion like this have twice as likely to have higher shareholder returns. So that's great for business, right? They actually have 28% higher revenue. That's something that's been studied in the UK. So these are specific to the UK. It's from a report by Accenture, the Disability Inclusion Advantage. They also see 30% better performance in economic profit margins. So it really does, if you need a business case for this, there really is a high business case for it, because, being twice as likely to increase something or have a 30% or third more revenue from something is just something I don't think any C-level would kind of go, oh no, we don't want that. We don't want that. It's like, we're not interested in that. So yeah, if you need a business case, please do use those figures for them. So let's talk about how to get started and how you can learn how to do this. I'm just gonna have another quick drink. Right. I've been using the term accessible language descriptive for what we're talking about and what we're trying to achieve. The common term that you'll find across the web when you're searching for this stuff is plain language or plain English. This is the term. There's a couple of campaigns for it as well, and this is the term that's kind of been adopted for it, but it essentially to me is accessible language, and that's how I'm referring to it here today. There are other things that are parts of accessible language that I'm going to include that stretch towards, layout and other things about the way we present language that you might not find in information about plain language specifically. So that's why I've bundled it into this term today. But know that they're kind of, to use a complex word, synonymous. They have the same meaning to me. There we go. So the first rule of thumb is use short and concise sentences. Stick to one main idea in a sentence. We're very used to being coached into providing like a reason and then a comma and then an explanation, or extending on an idea and using complex punctuation, like sticking a semicolon in there just to make it exciting. Sticking to one main idea per sentence really helps focus, and it means that also your text can be broken down by other people and pulled out into spaces with like a much more ease, and can be explained to others with ease as well. So any chance that you have to break up a long sentence, please do. If you notice that you're using a lot of commas, or you've got a sentence that has an and or a long list in there, or you've used that semicolon just to mix it up, think about why you're using it. Think about whether that actually needs to be one sentence, or if there is a way that you can make it into 2 or 3 just to make it easier to digest. Remove any unnecessary words. I'm terrible for this. I add like lots of, the one I think is like mostly, or like I try and accentuate words a lot with things, especially when I'm doing academic writing. And I just realized like it's not ever really necessary to do that, and to add these words in beforehand just ups the word count, and it doesn't really add anything to it. So when you're reading things back, think about what you're doing with those. The goal is to try to average 15 to 20 words for written content. So this is anything that you'll probably be reading in print. But when we come to the web, and because of the web reading times, we actually want this to be around 7 to 10 words, because anything longer than that, and you'll find that people will start to trail off of your content because it just gets a bit too complex to read online. The next main point is say exactly what you mean. And you're like, I think I am. I think I'm doing a good job of saying what I mean. Sometimes you are, sometimes you might not be. And here's some of the reasons why. So if you're not using easy to understand words, if we're choosing a complex word or perhaps jargon, that can be something that's, not inclusive, or it adds a barrier, adds complexity, especially if we're writing for the general public. So avoid jargon for the general public. You can, though, if you are writing for a technical audience, but you want to employ plain language, if you have an understanding that certain terms are universally known, there's no reason, well, within that audience, there's no reason that you shouldn't use them. It's just that if you are going to do something like that and you are going to put in a technical term, the very first time that you use that technical term, explain it. And then that doesn't isolate anybody who might have come across your content and isn't from that audience, or is from that audience but had never heard that term before. There's lots of times that you might have come across something and you've been like, oh, I haven't ever really heard that word to describe something. You also just need to consider the meaning of words, because there are some words, especially in English, we're terrible for this in English, to have dual meanings for words. Like the exact same word can be used in several sentences for different meanings. One of my favorites is issue can be used as a term to mean like I'm going to issue you with a library card, or there's an issue at the petrol station, or it's used in different contexts, and the context change the meaning. So when you're writing, especially for people who might have been learning English as a second language, this is something where they may have only heard a word in a specific context. So if you know that could have a dual meaning, then you're going to lose some of the audience, or you're at least going to confuse them for a short amount of time whilst they figure out why we're using this word that they've only ever heard in this context. The other thing is to avoid things like similes, metaphors, and idioms. So anybody who reads literally, idioms or metaphors, no matter how common they are, they'll be read by people in their literal sense, and that just doesn't make sense. Especially like if you're internationally working with people, I love finding out what I call Britishisms are amongst my friendship group, because when they've never heard of like a term, even in the UK, it's very funny. There are words and terms that I have found. I grew up in the Midlands and north of the UK, and I have words in my vocabulary and meanings for those words that Kevin, growing up in London, didn't have. He doesn't understand them. And I said, it's this. And he's like, what? So, anything that you might be falling into something that's a simile or a metaphor or a localization like that, sometimes they're called colloquialisms. Again, complex word for no reason. With like those kind of local language things, just be mindful that you're checking for those. There's a really nice term as well when we're talking about using complexity and hiding the meaning of what we're saying, and it's called camouflanguage. And this is an actual term. Definition is that when you hide the true meaning of what's being said through using overly complex words, and you might find this is actually like a tactic used by some companies in terms and conditions, things like that. We use overly complex language because we want to kind of hide the simplicity of something or hide the goal. And I just really like camouflanguage as a word. But that's something that you could learn today. Right, so the other point that we have a lot in plain language is something that you might be aware of doing or not doing, but using the active voice. Now, this is, if you've not learned about passive active voices, I mean, to be honest, if you've been out of school for a while, these are the things that you kind of taught to use in school, but not taught with this terminology. So you're using something that's the subject, the verb, then the object. So this can be, I'm going to use a simple sentence here. So I'm going to say, Amy gave the workshop. So that's me, the subject. Giving is the verb, and the object is the workshop. Amy gave the workshop. The way that people change things into passive voice is when people go, oh, the workshop was given by Amy. Now that's the simple sentence, but we've added 2 additional words in there to say the same thing. So when you get into more complex word structures, using the passive voice actually means that you have to add more words for it to make the same sense as the active. And so it's thinking about, you know, we had a discussion, or we discussed this, you know, it's changing the way that we talk a little bit. The other thing is, this is much quicker to read. If you write these things down, the difference in the sentence length, even at that short level, it's noticeable. So they are quicker to read when you use the active voice. They use less words. Sentences use less words when we're talking in active voice. And they avoid something called nominalizations, which is another complex word for when we take a verb that's normally in a verb form and we make it into a noun. So you'll find these happen a lot across corporate websites. Apply is one. So application, apply. You need to make an application, or please make an application for a loan. Please apply for a loan. the difference is huge. And when we do this thing where we change the verb into a noun, we add so much detail. So an example, like the implementation of the method has been done by a team. A team has implemented the method. The verb is implemented. They implemented the method. That makes sense. A team implemented the method. But when we have to say it the other way around, because we've made it into a noun, we have to introduce the implementation of the. It has to be that. And that adds, I cannot tell you how much different that sentence looks to read. The other one is discussed, discussion. There are many examples of these. Introduced to introduction. So Amy introduced us. The introduction was made by Amy. It's just such a longer way of talking, but we seem to want to default to this when we're writing specifically. It's not something we would often find we do in language when we're speaking amongst people. So one of the reasons, like one of the good ways to do this is imagine that you're talking to somebody across a table and think about how would you actually say that, rather than how do I word this so it's, you know, how do I word this? Because when you're writing, you want to include these extra words. Again, in academic writing, this is just rife because you don't want to necessarily talk in a first person voice, but you don't have to use the active voice either. So yeah, it just, they're problematic because they create this need for additional words, and that adds to our sentence length and just adds for the potential of confusion as well. So the other thing that I feel is more, as I say, talking about accessible language in general, is talking about arranging your writing in a clear manner as well. So clear headings and subheadings help people to navigate text, especially when you have people who might be reading through something online to find an answer to a question. They are going to scan for these things before they actually look at any of your content. Using lists to split up important information, especially if you want a response to important information in any way. So I use this in asynchronous communication a lot. If I have a lot of questions to ask one person that I'm going to put in a Slack message or anywhere else, I'll use bullet points to make sure that it's easy for somebody to read and understand that I want a response for each of these points. Because if somebody doesn't do that for me, I will often miss a question or two, or miss a point. And it makes it easier, and it makes it more obvious that there's like these other things that we're addressing today. Make any instructions really, really clear. If it requires somebody to do something, you have to make sure that that is obvious to the reader. and break large amounts of writing into smaller paragraphs. So think about the way that it's organized in terms of like making sure that you don't have this big block of text that's really difficult to search through and scan through. The other thing that you can do is you can test your content as well before you put it anywhere. So there are some testing indexes for accessible and plain language that measure different things. There's the Gunning Fog Index, the Flesch Reading Ease Scale, and the Smog Grade. These are just three of like some that are in use. I enjoy the Smog Grade because the actual breakout of that acronym there is the simple measure of gobbledygook. It's actually technically used as well, but it's just got such a silly name. I do enjoy it. But these things can be tested through online tools. So online tools exist for each of these. I've actually provided some links to those in the resources that I'm giving you. They are just like copy paste into, believe me, they're not the most attractive of websites. Definitely the people who work in these kind of word spaces have very accessible language about their sites, but their design could leaves much to be desired. But they work, and that's all you need to know really for testing content, is that you need to know some of these online tools will assess against all of them. Some of them will assess against like one or two of these, but just popping it in and seeing like, okay, is there anything that I can do to make that easier to read? Some will make suggestions as well. If you're using Word, this used to be the truth in Google Docs as well, but it got removed. I don't know why, but there's a readability score that's built into Word. So when you go into your tools, I think it's a similar place to where your word count is. You actually get a readability score in there, and that's based on things like the Flesch Reading Ease Scale. So that gives you like a percentage grade, and you can kind of figure out whether you want to work through that or what you can do to make that better. So how do we do this across different content types? Well, content does change the meaning, but basically those are the principles that you can apply everywhere that we've talked about before. And we'll talk about some specific things for different content. So social media, please avoid replacing words with symbols. And this even extends to using an ampersand instead of and. That's actually harder to read. So I know we're all like, try our best to do what we can with limited word counts or limited character counts if we're tweeting. And the temptation to replace the words like and for 3 characters with an ampersand is very high. But actually you make your reading more complex doing this. So just try and avoid this where you can. Try and avoid excessive use of symbols as well, where you might have used an EM dash or an elongated dash instead of using a comma. These are common things that I've done in my lifetime that I realize aren't the most accessible. And it just complicates the readability. Use the correct punctuation where you can. So most people don't think about writing online. There's like a lot of language we use online, we often do in NetSpeak or WebSpeak, and that can be like forgetting all things about punctuation and forgetting all things about capitalization and proper like written form, things that we're taught to do. But if you do forget to do these things, that makes things more complex to read, especially for someone like me. If there isn't a pause in a sentence, I can read it so many ways. And just an example is just like having a comma in the right place completely changes the emphasis. Avoid contractions of words. So avoid doing things like putting, we call, there's a term Slurvian, another nice term for you, where you might say gimme for instead of give me. And those kinds of things pop up online quite a lot. So stop contracting words in a slang manner, but even contracting words in ways that we expect, like using don't instead of do not. It's just clearer to read do not than it is don't. Capitalization matters. I think most of us know this, but in English especially, like if I write polish and I write it without a capital, it's Polish, but if I write it with a capital, it's Polish. And if I'm talking about an international audience and we're talking about Polish culture, like the last thing I want to do is make that a not capitalized letter and talk about Polish culture, because it's two very different things. we don't want to do that. So make sure that you're checking your capitalization where it matters. On top of this, hashtags really matter for that as well. If you capitalize every word in your hashtag, that will actually work better for a screen reader. So just know that doing that not only makes it more readable, because having a mash of words together in a hashtag is always difficult anyway, but having the capitalization makes more sense to screen readers as well. So screen readers will read those more correctly, because otherwise there's no definition to a computer or a program that's running a screen reader. It will just try and read it as much as you can in one. It'll make a mess of it, believe me. And absolutely do not use emojis as a replacement for words. I'm not saying don't use emoji, but don't use them for a replacement of words, because that can be where it gets complex. Emojis often help us convey that emotional content to what we're saying, but it doesn't help if we just replace them. And if you are using them excessively, these are another complete source of irritation for people who have screen readers that are just reading all of these emojis in a thing. And I was approached by somebody who DM'd me on Twitter about this, because I used to have a lot of emoji in my display name, and somebody called me out. They were like, you say you work in accessibility, but you do this. And I'm like, yeah, do you know what? That sucks. Sugar, I shouldn't have done that. I just didn't think, and I didn't think about my general audience. So again, we all can make these mistakes from time to time. The point is to just know that we can work towards improving them. In emails, keep the subject line concise. I think we all try to do this, but this is something that you definitely should do, so people understand exactly what you're trying to approach them about. Avoid excessive use of words. This is, as we've gone through, keep your sentence shorter, but there's a term for excessive use of words called logorrhea. And it's when somebody's loquacious, very loquacious, which means somebody who just throws a load of words in there because they're trying to say something, but it might be because of politeness or because of whatever reason. And we do this a lot in emails because we're trying to approach a subject that might be difficult, or talk about a work concept that we don't necessarily, that we might be dancing around. This is something that we should definitely try to avoid to do. And you try and just keep those really short sentences, apply the concept of reading for the web, because this is online that people will be reading, and try and keep 7 to 10 words. Try to not dance around things. Try to really recognize when you're putting in those unnecessary words. Again, using the list to split up information. As I said, that even transfers to business communications that aren't through emails, but through Slack. I do this a lot. And avoid placing words inside of other words. This is called tmesis, and it's something that I find Brits do, like fan bloody tastic. We do that. We use it in our language, or we say unfreaking believable. We say stuff like that in our language, and sometimes in emails especially, we take that correspondence, we take it that conversational correspondence level there, and we'll use hyphens in between the things, and it literally just makes the words harder to read. So try avoiding doing that, if that's something that you use in your vocabulary anyway. And for web content, we come back to the importance of headings and subheadings. The thing about this is not just if you're somebody who's writing for the web, but not necessarily the person who's programming that or doing the front end development, you just need to make sure that these are made clear to the people who are going to do that, and that they're not just using something like style sheets to change the appearance of these. They need to be done programmatically. So they need to have something called semantic HTML assigned to them, so that people who are navigating with assistive technology know that that's a heading and that's a subheading. And then you can add style to them to make sure that they're all in the same font or whatever. Keep the sentences short, again, a reminder, 7 to 10 words. And please use contextual link text. I actually have a badge from an accessibility conference that is just a white badge on a square, and it has click here in blue underlined, because it's a trope within the accessibility community. Having something, and who's done this? I've definitely done this. I've definitely had this in a website at some point. I've put read more, click here, and that's the bit of text that I've highlighted for the link. Because actually, when you have 10 of those within a web page, there's a couple of things you can do with assistive tech, and one of them is navigate via links. And if you have 10 links that all say read more, read more, read more, read more, it's like, I don't have a clue, but I'm navigating via that way. So that can be a way that people do generally navigate, because they want to look for the useful information first. They don't want to read through all the text to know where they're headed. And it's something that's afforded to somebody who might not be using a screen reader, who doesn't have the requirements of that being read out to them, who can see the visual content because of the layout. And that's obvious to them because of the layout. But for somebody who doesn't, that's a very frustrating thing to come across. So if you are going to do that, think about, is there a way that I can say, more about and the subject that we've just been talking about? More about synthesis. I know that where that link's going to take me now, but I didn't before when it just said read more. Use left aligned text online. This is something that, again, is an arrangement thing, but if you use anything like justified text or centralized text, you can come across something where we call them like white rivers in text, or like gaps in text. If you're using magnification and something is justified or not left aligned, what you'll find is there'll be these big gaps. So when you magnify it, you can get lost because you just come across a sea of the background color or whatever it is, and you can't navigate to where you just came from, because it just doesn't give you any indication of where the next word is. And whilst you're doing like thinking about your arrangement, if there is content that you can support with images where appropriate, this is actually very helpful for people with dyslexia and people who think in a more image focused way. So yeah, that is like a whirlwind summary of the things that you can do. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask me right now, we've got some time for that. If we don't have questions, we've got a little bit of time to get ourselves a drink and a refresh, and then we can go into our activities. So I guess I'm opening the floor.